Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of Yo on the Go Leadership Moments. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Jeff Lince. Dr. Jeff Lince is a private consultant specializing in the areas of tribology, coatings, and surface chemistry, specifically applications to space and vacuum. He's a world-recognized expert in solid lubrication and sliding electrical contacts, things like slip rings for space applications. Thanks for coming on the program, Jeff. You have a very deep expertise in lubrication, and I understand as a material scientist, lubrication is a tricky thing because your lubrication can degrade with time, with heat, with movement. But there's something about space. It doesn't seem like there's anything different about space. What would that be an issue, putting conventional lubricants in space?
Oh, there's so much difference about space. Thanks for having me, by the way. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. But yeah, space is very different from the ground. I mean, the big difference is if you have something on the factory floor, machinery, and the lubricant level's getting low, you open a little port on the side, you squirt some more oil in, and you're good to go for another month. In space, most of the time anyway, you send something up there, and if you run out of lubricant, that's it, mission over. Now, I say most of the time because there are examples like the space station where you have astronauts and they can send a new device up there or more lubricant, and they can go out and do a spacewalk and tune things up and stuff like that. So but that generally, most missions you cannot go up and service it. The other issue is that you have a vacuum, and most oils and greases, if terrestrial oils and greases, you can smell them. And if you can smell them, it means they have an appreciable vapor pressure. In space, that's not so good because you use smaller amount of lubricants and they can evaporate and dry out your parts. You can also evaporate lubricants all over sensitive optical equipment. And you can't send someone up with a chamois cloth to wipe off the lens off of your multi-million-dollar sensor. Um, so so the vacuum aspect is critical. The other thing is you're very limited with weight and size and power budgets and things like that we're in your car, so we can compare that to a space vehicle. Your car undergoes maybe a few million cycles in its lifetime. Average satellite going for 10, 15 years can have billions of cycles on, say, a control moment gyroscope or a reaction wheel or something like that. So, so with a car also, you're putting in quarts of oil, right? And if it gets low, you put in new quarts, you change the oil filter. You want to use, as I mentioned before, smaller amounts of lubricant on spacecraft. Suppose you have a gyroscope. It takes power to run the gyroscope, and oil is good in that it lowers the friction and it lowers the wear between the metal parts and the ball bearings. But you're also swimming through that oil because of viscous drag, and that requires power. So they generally only use a few hundred or 100 milligrams of oil in a lot of these space devices. If you go to too much oil, you get more drag. If you get more drag, you need a bigger motor. If you get a bigger motor, you have a bigger power budget. You need bigger solar arrays. You need a bigger satellite. You need a bigger launch vehicle. So there's this whole cascading effect. And the driving need is to have small amounts of oil. But this also requires, you have all these trade-offs. I think you're starting to see what the difficult issues are in this. You have all these trade-offs because your average oil that you use, A1 oil in a can or an industrial oil, they are not very controlled as far as their molecular structure and their composition. So you have extra species in there that can chemically degrade and increase the viscosity of the oil, or it can cause other problems to happen. So so yeah.
Yeah, so you're really saying that all of the lubrication that's been developed is really for terrestrial applications, and that's
Right.
because we have a use case here on Earth. But when you're dealing with space, you have a lot of constraints. Those constraints are the lack of resurfacing, so you can't add more oil. The
Hmm.
problem also is that the oil, when I'm in a car, it gets burned up inside the engine and gets exhausted. But in this case, it's a closed environment, and so that oil that breaks down gets deposited somewhere else, and that somewhere else is in the rest of your spacecraft, which makes it very challenging.
Right.
Got it.
Right.
Got
And
it.
also you need to come up with new compositions, because if you're only using this small amount of oil, it's got to work perfectly for extremely long periods without
Hmm.
degradation of the performance of your device. And that
And you're
means
saying million
synthetic,
cycles between a billion cycles. So,
right?
got
So,
it.
so there are lubricants that have literally been synthesized directly for or specifically for spacecraft use. And as you can imagine, they're very expensive. So like 100 grams of some of these oils can cost over $1,000, which is,
Hmm.
you know, do the quick math, a liter of oil can be over $10,000,
Hmm.
you know.
I'll
So,
never talk about synthetic oil again in that way for my car, how expensive
right,
that is. That's incredible.
yeah.
In terms of the oil itself, does it have like radiation hardness that has to be rad hard?
You know, you would think so, but in my career, I've seen very, very few issues with that. And I think the
Really?
main reason is most lubricated devices are contained within the spacecraft. They're not, if you have something with oil or grease on it, it's not going to be way on the outside of the spacecraft. It's going to be contained within multiple shells of
Okay.
containers, and that pretty much shields them. That there are some cases where that is an issue, and they've done studies of that. But in my career, it just hasn't really come up that often.
Interesting. So the just the application itself gives you that inherent shielding that alleviates the need to do rad hard testing on these
That's right.
components.
Yeah,
Interesting.
there's been, you know, I was talking about oils and greases so far. There are also solid lubricants.
Hmm.
And those are important for temperature extremes, because of course you increase or decrease the temperature, the viscosity of your oil is going to change a lot, whereas that's not true with solids.
Hmm.
Um, and there's also, you know, so they are used more on the outside of a spacecraft because they're expected to be less contaminating. They can't creep along the surface like a liquid film can. And there's been some studies of the effect of atomic oxygen in the space environment, not so much radiation. But the thing about atomic oxygen, it's just sitting in orbit. The energy, it gets its energy from the velocity of the spacecraft. So it's only in one direction. It's in the ram direction of the spacecraft, basically. And if you have a solid lubricant that's directly facing that, you can get some degradation, and there's people that have done some studies in that. But generally, it's off at an angle, or it also is contained in at least one layer of material to block it off.
That's really interesting. Hadn't
Yeah,
considered that. So you have atomic oxygen in the air, and not really air. It's in vacuum, but it's, because it's in the bottom part of or top part of the atmosphere, and
right.
now it's the impact velocity of the spacecraft going through orbit that's now energizing it and causing degradation on particular sides. That's
That's
really
right. Yeah,
interesting.
I mean, the spacecraft is going so fast, you actually get about 5 electron volts of energy in the
Really
atomic oxygen, and that's
interesting.
enough to do chemistry, you know.
Wow. So you're actually getting activation energy chemistry because of the orbital velocity.
Right.
That's really,
And
really
there are other
incredible.
materials other than lubricants that really are out there and facing the atomic oxygen flow, and they do have to worry about that stuff. And they've done space experiments where they've sent a platter with a large amount of different materials and
Mm.
exposed it to atomic oxygen and brought it back and look at the effects.
Wonderful. So it's clear that there's a lot of nuances with lubrication, especially in space. What do you bring to the table when you are consulting for companies in this particular field?
Well, the lubrication, you know, other than the synthetic lubricants, there's a lot of things that are very run of the mill about lubrication, like the solid lubricants. Um, One of the main preparations that they use is a bonded solid lubricant film, and it's basically just a resin or some other liquid binder, and you mix uh, lubricating powder, solid lubricant powder with that, put it in an oven for a little while and bake it. And it's essentially a paint, but instead of a colored binder, you have, I mean, a colored pigment, you have a lubricating pigment. And they've been around since, World War II, when they started using them in bombers and things like that. So it's a very low tech type of formulation, but there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of these bonded solid lubricant coatings. So each one is a little different. Some of them are fine for the factory floor, some are okay for short-term use on airplanes or whatever, and some are just better for long-term spacecraft applications. They have lower friction and their endurance is much longer. So I think one of the things I can bring to the table is just the sort of the corporate memory, so to speak, or the consultant memory, I guess you'd call it, of, you know, what are the overall experimental results on a lot of these things, because you really can't just go to the shelf and say, okay, I've built my spacecraft mechanism. I'm going to go to the shelf. Well, this worked before. I'm just paint this on or shake a little of this on and assume it's going to work. Hopefully you catch that stuff during testing later on. But if you don't, if you want to save a lot of time and money and angst, you plan in the beginning, you include in your design process, not just the design of the mechanical components and their materials, but the actual lubricating materials on there. And I think that that's certainly something that I can help with.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for the insight into space tribology. Dr. Jeff Lince, thank you so much for this opportunity to hear about that. For those who are interested in learning more about Jeff's work, please look at the links below, both on the video as well as in the descriptions, and he'll be able to direct you and give you guidance for your next space project or other lubrication projects, so that there are opportunities to keep those things from going awry in the future, because of his great advice. So I hope this was helpful for you, and thanks, Jeff, for the time that we had together. And
Well, thank you, Terrence. I really enjoyed it.
yeah. So until next time, bye.